So, do we have any questions left over from last time when we spent a couple of days on all of the different controversial proposals in Book 5 of Plato's Republic? Any lingering leftover issues? There's a lot there, obviously. So, and what he goes on to say, we can reflect back on what happens in Book 5 and maybe get a little bit more perspective. You know, this next book, Book 6, deals with some of the same issues in a different way. You know, what it takes to be a good leader. Could you have philosopher rulers? You know, he spent a lot of time, as we discussed, after giving us this picture of radical communism and everything, talking about the difference between theory and practice and how something that's perfect in theory may not ever be able to be completely actualized, and probably can't be. And Book 6 is a lot about that issue, about, you know, the difference between theory and practice, and why it is that it would be so difficult for philosophers to rule. So, you know, one of the things that he does here is describe in more detail what is a philosopher? What kind of activity does the philosopher undertake? You know? And then he'll discuss by contrast, you know, is that the kind of person who would be a good leader, who could lead, okay? So a philosopher is somebody who thinks about what is permanent, okay? Not what changes, but what is permanent. And of course, the political world is all about change, isn't it? You know, it's adjusting to change. It's leading change as well, okay? But the philosopher thinks about what is permanent. And he's already expressed that this is because what is permanent is what is true. You know, that's what truth really is. And we can only grasp it in our minds, but it can only be dully reflected in reality, okay? So the philosopher studies what is true, being, and not what is becoming, to use terminology that was developed a lot later, Heidegger. So, obviously the philosopher is, some might say, almost too disconnected from the things of the body, okay? And remember, this is Plato's definition of a philosopher, okay? Not everybody's, as we'll see, not even Aristotle agrees with this, okay? But for Plato, a philosopher is one who diminishes to the point of not concern with the things of the body, okay? And concentrates instead on enjoying the pleasures of the mind, which he believes are very superior to the pleasures of the body, much to be preferred. And part of the reason for that is because they're unmixed with pains, unlike all physical pleasures, which, as you know even from the Gorgias dialogue, is truly the case with all physical pleasures. They're always mixed with pains. The pleasures of the mind are unmixed, okay? So he says, for instance, on page 159, then when someone's desires flow towards learning and everything of that sort, he'd be concerned, I suppose, with the pleasures of the soul by itself, and he'd abandon those pleasures that come from the body, if indeed he is a true philosopher and not merely a counterfeit one. Okay? But we know that a lot of people would respond to him, but politics is a lot about the things of the body. Okay? It's about, you know, making sure people have enough to eat, that they're safe, that they have shelter. I mean, these are very basic things that if you are involved in politics, you have to be aware of and you have to be concerned about. So how can a philosopher who spends all his time disregarding the needs of the body possibly be able to identify with the role of a leader or with politics? And actually, he says the philosopher disregards death itself, because his mind is so wrapped up with the things that are eternal already, okay, that it's almost like he's halfway to heaven already. He's got one foot in eternal life. And so he doesn't really care about life. He disregards it, not so much because he's become brave in the, you know, the sort of ordinary sense, okay? The philosopher may have never seen physical danger, maybe, maybe not. But rather, it's just not important because his current experience doesn't draw his attention to life and the fear of death, but rather just so much, he dwells so much in the realm of ideas. He says on page 160 up at the top, and will a thinker high-minded enough to study all the time and all being consider human life to be something important? He couldn't possibly. Then he will consider death to be a terrible thing? He least of all. Okay. All right, so the philosopher least of all will consider death to be a terrible thing. And he says, then it seems a cowardly and slavish nature will take no part in true philosophy. And is there any way that an orderly person who isn't money-loving, slavish, a boaster, or a coward could become unreliable or unjust? And there he ties up the idea that the philosopher who disregards death, who thinks constantly about what is permanent, is very likely to be just. If he's doing what he's supposed to do, if he's a philosopher, he will understand justice and he will not be just. But that he will be just, but it's these people who will not be, okay? The boaster, the money lover, the coward, okay? So maybe it sounds good to be a philosopher because it's almost like he's describing a state of nirvana or enlightenment, okay? But you can see just from looking at this list of qualities how far removed that is from what you would consider political concerns. Okay? Because in this last case, what's the most important job of any leader for his society if he's doing his job? He's got to protect them from death. He's got to protect them from at least untimely death, right, in the form of attacks. He's got to provide for the national defense. So would you want somebody who doesn't think enough about those things to be in charge? You know, Socrates has just said in Book 5, unless philosophers become kings, we'll have no end to war. We'll never have peace. And yet now he's describing somebody that, would call into mind some doubts about, could such a person really provide peace? How could he do that? I mean, after all, though he may be able to create a perfect republic, which is pretty dubious right there, he's going to be surrounded by other cities who might be very hostile. Is such a person going to be able to come out of the eternal ideas and think practically about such mundane things as the national defense? Okay? So that's why Adeimantus says, it seems to me that such a person is quite useless to the state. Okay? It seems like such a person would be useless because they wouldn't be practical enough. They wouldn't have enough of a grounding in reality to be able to protect the state. So, in other words, are you really saying, for real, that a philosopher would be the best ruler? Okay? So, rather than, this is another clue maybe that Socrates isn't trying to give us just a blueprint for a perfect city here, because rather than saying, now wait a minute, you're wrong, the philosopher, though he's studying the eternal ideas, will still have enough ability to be able to successfully rule too. Instead of saying that, he gives us this metaphor of the ship of state, okay? And it's an extended description of the philosopher's position relative to other people in any real city, okay? And in particular, probably the one that they come from, Athens, but you could probably apply this to a lot of different cities. So I want to read this to you to remind you of all the elements and then ask you what you think this is all about, okay? Who these people really are. Okay, he says, imagine that something like the following happens on a ship or on many ships. The ship owner is bigger and stronger than anybody else on board, but he's hard of hearing, a bit short-sighted, and his knowledge of seafaring is equally deficient. Okay, so we have a ship owner. All right. The sailors are quarreling with one another about steering the ship, each of them thinking that he should be the captain, even though he's never learned the art of navigation, cannot point to anyone who taught it to him or to a time when he learned it. Indeed, they claim that it isn't teachable, and they're ready to cut to pieces anyone who says that it is. They're always crowding around the ship owner, begging him and doing everything possible to get him to turn the rudder over to them. And sometimes if they don't succeed in persuading him, they execute the ones who do succeed and throw them overboard, and then having stupefied their noble ship owner with drugs, wine, or in some other way, they rule the ship, using up what's in it and sailing in the way that people like that are prone to. Okay, so we've got sailors trying to get the ship owner to give them the rudder. Okay. All right, so then he says, moreover, they, that is the sailors, call the person who is clever at persuading or forcing the ship owner to let them rule, a navigator, a captain, and one who knows the ship, and dismiss anyone else as useless. Excuse me, I think I missed a line there. They call the person who is clever at persuading or forcing the ship owner to let them rule, a navigator, a captain, or one who knows the ship, and dismiss anyone else as useless. They don't understand that a true captain must pay attention to the seasons of the year, the sky, the stars, the winds, and all that which pertains to his craft if he's really to be the ruler of the ship. And they don't believe that there is any craft that would enable him to determine where he should steer the ship to, independently of whether the others want to go there or not, or any possibility of mastering this alleged craft or practicing it if at the same time as practicing it at the same time as the craft of navigation. So you've got somebody called a navigator or a pilot or a true captain. But the sailors dismiss that person. He says, don't you think that the true captain will be called a real stargazer, a babbler, and a good-for-nothing by those who sail in ships governed in that way? Okay? So they call themselves the true captain, and they call a pilot who knows something about the stars and how to navigate by them a babbler. Okay? So let's take a few minutes and think about what these various roles really represent. Okay, who do you think the ship owner is? Who's that supposed to represent?
Would that be representing the people of the state of democracy?
Okay, yeah, actually. The people, and this is what confuses a lot of people about this ship metaphor, is he goes from talking about the ideal city to talking in book 6 about real politics, about the way things really are. And so, yes, the ship owner represents the people. They are the ones, at least in a democratic setting, who supposedly own the state. They rule, but they are easily manipulated. Okay? So the sailors, who do they represent? Okay, she said the upper class.
I was going to say the politicians.
Okay. Yeah, what in Gorgias we called the rhetoricians, which oftentimes would be of the upper class. These would be the sons of the upper class. You know, in the Gorgias, that's who they were. People who are trying to learn how to manipulate the masses, okay, through the use of rhetoric. They were the politicians, okay. Now, what is it about these sailors that makes them unqualified to steer the ship, according to this picture that he's painting?
I think it's that they strive to gain their own, improve their own personal status. They don't necessarily have the best interest of the ship because they don't know how to navigate, and they often might kill those who gain the status, so they stab each other in the back to get ahead.
They don't have the knowledge of navigation, but that doesn't stop them from making every attempt to take over the ship, and they do that by trying to manipulate the captain. And if they have to, he says they get him drunk and basically bamboozle him that way. okay? And so if they represent the politicians, then getting the people drunk, from what we know from the Gorgias, it's probably, sort of inflaming their passions, getting them to think that they're just when they're not really just, convincing them that they're good people when they're really just doing what the sailors or the politicians want them to do, okay? So, and of course, who's the true pilot then?
Stargazer.
Yeah, right. The philosopher, he's the stargazer. He's, which from the sailor's point of view, he's just useless. He sits there, he's not interested, it seems to them, in the ship or controlling the ship. He doesn't act like a normal human being. All he wants to do is look up the stars and try to figure out what's going on, okay? And they don't get the connection between that and where the ship's going, okay? Because they simply want to have the power to determine where it goes, but they don't know where it should go, okay? They don't really have much of an idea about where it should go, okay? That's part of Plato's criticism of democratic rule, is that politicians spend a lot of time thinking about how to get in their position, but they don't think a lot about, when I'm in that position, what am I really going to do with it? What should I do with it? It becomes about getting the position and holding the position rather than doing something with it. In order to do something with it that's good, he says you have to know what it is that you should aim at. Now, the navigator, back in those days, the only way that they could navigate was by understanding the stars. That's when, if it clouded up for a few days, we had to wait for the weather to clear. So that truly was, a burgeoning or a new field of study that was helping them to get farther and to have fewer accidents and so forth. What would the equivalent be for the philosopher? What's the philosopher thinking about and studying that makes people think that he's just a sort of babbler?
Perhaps things like earlier when he was talking about having pleasures of the mind instead of pleasures of the body, that might seem like babbling to more the masses.
Yeah, all of those things that he's characterized the philosopher caring about don't seem to make much sense to ordinary people. And they look at such a person and they say, well, he seems to be concentrating on inconsequential things, things that don't really matter to my daily life. What's he doing? He's wasting his time. So yes, he's thinking about justice, he's thinking about the good, and contemplating and what does this really have to do, especially in a democratic setting where we're used to people thinking about their self-interest and going into political action accordingly, taking political action to pursue what they think is in their self-interest, okay? And the politicians are supposed to listen to them, okay? So here we have this person who's not listening, to popular opinion, and instead he's spending a lot of time contemplating and talking about abstract ideas. Doesn't seem like a very good fit. So the people would call such a person, as Adeimantus has, useless to the state, a babbler, somebody who doesn't know anything about politics, okay? So he's definitely depicted the ironic situation of the philosopher that he thinks is the best qualified to rule, but yet he can't rule because people won't let him rule. Okay? There's other problems with this, but this is a really big one that he does acknowledge. That there's such a gap between the way the philosopher thinks and what he thinks is important and what the ordinary citizens, as well as the politicians, think is important. There's a gap that just seems insurmountable, and people will reject it. In democracy, you have to get the majority, right? How can such a person ever get the majority support? There's a whole lot of writing in what comes next which can confirm the meaning of that metaphor. But among other things, he spends time talking about that disconnect, you know, between the people and how they see such a person, as opposed to how they see a politician who seems to be so much more about their concerns, is willing to talk to them about their concerns, sympathize with them, you know, knows in detail what those problems are and so forth. Okay? So the first obstacle to philosopher rule is this, that people will react with hostility because they don't understand this person or how he can connect to them. He seems to be out of touch, as they say. Okay? And the philosopher is not terribly well equipped, because he hasn't spent his life studying rhetoric. He's not terribly well equipped to overcome that obstacle. Okay? He can't switch into sailor mode in order to, you know, easily in order to persuade people. Okay? So there's that obstacle. Another obstacle which he discusses to philosopher rule is that the philosophic nature can be corrupted. Now, once one is a full philosopher, I think it's impossible in his mind to corrupt them. But the problem is that growing up in a society like Athens, the person may be born with a philosophic nature, meaning that they have the aptitude to become a philosopher because they're intelligent, they're curious, you know, they're deep thinkers. But as they're growing up, they can be swept up by a sophist, by a politician type who leads them away from their true calling. Okay? And because they're very clever, they're attracted to such people who are more clever than most. Okay? And they can be led away from their true calling. Okay? So I found this to be really interesting. He's describing this on page 165. He says, this then won't we say that the same thing about souls too, Adeimantus, that those with the best natures become outstandingly bad when they receive a bad upbringing? Okay, you understand that? Okay, the worst people, you know, the exceedingly bad, are people who have the philosophic aptitude, but they are not provided the right kind of education. Can you see why? A highly intelligent person, capable of deep thought, strategic thought, and so forth, with the wrong aims, can become a very dangerous person. He says, or do you think that great injustices and pure wickedness originate in an ordinary nature rather than in a vigorous one that has been corrupted by its upbringing? So the most evil people, the ones who can do the most damage, are those with the kind of mind that can also develop into a philosopher. So it's very, very important that such a person be cultivated from his youth in the right direction. And it's kind of interesting because I think we still very much believe that, you know. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I read that, I was reminded how over the summer I read a book about the Nuremberg trials for the Nazis and the Holocaust. And it said how there were, like, I think 20 politicians that were put on trial, and how before the trial they were given intelligence and aptitude tests, and how all of them except for, I think, the Luftwaffe commander, I forgot what he was called, but they all had IQs of around 140 or higher, and the average is 100. And just how almost all of them were technically genius level, but were, you know, being tried for the Holocaust. And when I read that, I was kind of, you know, remembered about that.
Yeah, very good example, which kind of should back us up a little bit, you know, because we're told, and for the most part we get the impression that Plato thinks that, you know, reason leads to goodness, or that reason automatically makes a person just. But here he is saying reason properly educated and cultivated. It can be, a person just because they have a great aptitude like that, a big IQ, does not mean that they will become a good person unless they're exposed to the right ideas and, you know, trained up in a certain way. And we see through a lot of what he said before, leading up to this point, You know, he spends a lot of time on what the education of these leaders ought to be, you know. And he criticizes, by implication, a lot of the education that leaders actually receive. You know, that education can corrupt their minds and lead them to, in this instance, you know, a career of manipulating people rather than actually guiding them. Yeah, yeah. So, yes, very good example, reminded me of Martin Heidegger. You know, Heidegger joined the Nazi Party. I'm not sure why we still take Heidegger's writing seriously, actually. I think that disqualifies him. But a precursor of existentialism. Okay? So we've already kind of talked about this in a way, but the people, he says, resent the philosophers. He says, can the majority in any way tolerate or accept the reality of the beautiful itself? Okay? He gets into a little bit of why there's such a gap. You know, can the majority really accept the reality of the beautiful itself as opposed to the many beautiful things around them? Or the reality of each thing itself as opposed to the corresponding many? In other words, can they think like this? Can they think abstractly? Okay? Not in any way. So then the majority cannot be philosophic. They cannot. Hence, they inevitably disapprove of those who practice philosophy because they can't understand it. Okay? So in effect, he's making the same point in a different way there as the first point. Then he says, under these conditions, if a true philosopher wants to survive, he will not be a public figure. He will not try to get involved in politics as he wants his philosopher kings to do, but rather he'll live a private life. Okay? And he describes two different ways of life. The philosopher who, he says, consorts with his marriage partner in philosophy, okay, which leads to a lot of good things, although private. Like, you know, he lived a sort of quasi-private life, okay, Socrates, that is. He never ran for office. He never tried to be a politician. On the other hand, he didn't hide under a basket either. He was out in public teaching people and so forth, and skirting the edge, you might say. Maybe stepping over it just a little bit because he was involved in criticizing political things. Okay? And he paid a high price, right, because of even going that far. And he also describes those who who marry badly. Okay? Those are the people who are not brought up well, who become sophists or rhetoricians. And the children that they produce, unlike the philosopher's children, which are the blessed or good ideas, they produce bad ideas, bad children. This is another spot in the dialogue that I've been focusing on because it speaks to me about what's going on in Book 5 when he talks about the men and women producing children and the children being raised in common and so forth. But it's kind of interesting. He also brings back in baldness. Kind of makes you wonder if Socrates had a problem with baldness in his own life. Or whether maybe he was proud of having a lot of hair. I'm not sure which, but he says down at the bottom of 169, then he's speaking of the bad sort. Okay, here he says, don't you think a man of this sort looks exactly like a little bald-headed tinker who has come into some money and having been just released from jail, has taken a bath, put on a new cloak, got himself up as a bridegroom, and is about to marry the boss's daughter because she is poor and abandoned. Okay? Taking advantage of, every opportunity he can. And Adeimantus says exactly the same. Socrates says, and what kind of children will that marriage produce? Won't they be illegitimate and inferior? They'd have to be. What about when men who are unworthy of education approach philosophy and consort her unworthily? What kinds of thoughts and opinions are we say they beget? Won't they truly be what are probably called sophisms, things that have nothing genuine about them or are worthy of being called true wisdom? That's absolutely right. Okay? Then there remains Adeimantus only one very small group who consort with philosophy in a way that's worthy of her. A noble and well brought up character, for example, kept down by exile, who remains with philosophy according to his nature, because there is no one to corrupt him, or a great soul living in a small city who disdains the city's affairs and looks beyond them. That's a good partnership. Okay? So it seems to me it speaks back to what's being said in Book 5 in the metaphor of the soul, you know, and when these two, the male and the female, get together and produce children, it seems very similar to what he's describing here when he talks about the true philosopher marrying and, you know, begetting good children. So there's these two types of people. These people aren't brought up well. They try to court philosophy, but they only do so in order to gain enough knowledge to get ahead, in other words. They can think well, but they use their ability to think well to promote themselves and to obtain whatever they want, power, money, etc. Okay? They produce bad outcomes, but those are what populate the city. That's what you know, rules in a democracy. Whereas the true philosopher who can live in a democracy, he has to kind of hide away in order to be able to continue to peacefully do what he wants to do. He cannot do what even Socrates did and step his toe over the line and start criticizing politics, because he's likely to be stopped. So it's an ironic situation for the philosopher, and it means that the people are shortchanged, supposedly, okay? But they don't even know that they're shortchanged. They think they're being served well, okay, by the philosopher. By the sophist. Would any city be more amenable to philosophy? Would any type of city, maybe other than a democracy, be more friendly to philosophers and allow them to have more influence? Can you think of any political system where they might have more influence?
Yeah, maybe a monarchy.
Okay.
I think maybe a monarchy, just because you have that king or queen and they make all the decisions, but generally I feel like just things I've read in movie, TV, they always have like those philosophers in their court that are always constantly thinking about things for the king, and they're always trying to get the king's ear to get their ideas to him.
Mm-hmm. Would that be the closest, probably, you think? You know, now, if it was a benevolent and good monarchy, which sometimes happens, you know, where a king rules and is truly interested in his people's welfare, that would probably come the closest to being a type of city or a type of country where an intellectual could, you know, have some influence. When you were saying that, though, I was thinking of, has anybody watched The Tudors?
Yeah.
Okay. You remember, you know, Thomas More trying to have some influence on the situation, and as time went by, Henry got ever more irrational and you know, tied up in his own weird agenda, and you know, next thing you know, Thomas More is, you know, executed. So, and yet that monarch was considered to be a real humanist, you know, really interested to a greater degree in ideas than a lot of others had been. But in the end, his own private interest and his own agenda took over. And he wanted to use Thomas More, but only as a kind of appendage. And so for the most part, this is what Socrates thinks happens to philosophers in a monarchy or an aristocracy type situation, where you have a one or a few ruling. Okay, most of the time they see the philosopher as somebody who's an appendage who will maybe help them do what they want to do, but otherwise they don't want to hear them. Okay, and then when you think about oligarchy, that's ruled by the wealthy. What kind of philosopher might be comfortable in such a city? Not the kind that Socrates wants, huh? maybe a Adam Smith kind of philosopher, somebody who's interested in economics maybe, but not the type of philosopher that he's talking about. So there's not very many places in the world, in Socrates' Apology, when he was getting ready to admit defeat, basically, and leading up to his execution, he says, I would not want to live anyplace else other than this democracy, because at least it's allowed me to speak as long as I did. There's no other city, in other words, there's no tyranny or monarchy or oligarchy or any other type of government which he felt would be any more friendly to him than democracy. And democracy was friendly to him simply because until he got really, really irritating and some bad things happened, people just really didn't care, what he was doing. There was a lot of apathy in a democracy, a lot of people just going about their lives, and only a few people might listen to Socrates, and who really cares? Only in the wake of the Peloponnesian War, when people were really angry and impoverished and looking for somebody to blame, did they think, aha, what about Socrates? But otherwise, he would have been free by neglect, to be able to do what he wanted to do. Now, there's another barrier which he discusses to philosophic rule, which is that the philosopher has to force himself to rule even if he's asked. Okay? And in the Republic, he's depicted this by saying that the philosophers will take turns ruling. They won't spend all their time ruling because it's a burdensome task. The sophists want to be politicians. But a philosopher does not. He does want to spend all of his time thinking about just pure ideas. Okay? But he realizes that he has a duty and a responsibility, and so he forces himself to do it. Okay? So this quality of the philosopher, that he doesn't concern himself with everyday life, that he'd rather be someplace else, okay, means that it's just a constant burden. It's a constant, problem. Of course, this is the Platonic idea of the statesman. The true leader is someone who doesn't want to lead from this point of view. The true leader is somebody who's asked to and feels a responsibility to, but does not want to, because such a person would be without any self-interest, wouldn't be doing it for any other reason than the common good. So this is the kind of leader you want, but how to find people who are this pure that they would actually make themselves do what they do not want to do, okay? How often do you find people like that?
What were you said about George Washington?
Washington would be a great example. Yeah, we mentioned that last time. Washington was asked to be king, actually. Some people thought, well, he would make an excellent king, this great general. And if not, then president, okay? Well, he decided he'd say no to kingship, so he actually, didn't take advantage of the situation. And furthermore, that he would not be president in perpetuity, right? But serve for a good period of time and then step down. So he created the precedent that we still have, right? So, yep, they do come along, but we remember Washington because it's rare. Political ambition is much more common. Somebody who feels a responsibility and a duty is more rare. So that's why even today we're uncomfortable with the fact that so many of our politicians seem to be self-serving, careerists, okay? On the other hand, that's the way we set up the system. In a democracy, what else can you expect? Okay, that's what the incentive structure is set up to produce. Now, we like democracy, but this type of teaching does give us some perspective on it. And it makes me wonder if we shouldn't just stop complaining about that, because frankly, unless you want to change the system, it's pretty much impossible to get away from that situation. It's the rare beast who doesn't care about their career, right, and their political future and so forth. All right, so After all of this, Glaucon says, well, I would like to know what you know, Socrates. Socrates is hinting that the philosopher has some really special knowledge that once he has it, transforms his view of life and makes him so different from everybody else. And Glaucon wants to know if Socrates can teach him that. Can he describe it further? Can he maybe take him all the way there? Okay? And Socrates, very characteristically, again, he's reluctant. He says, I'm not sure I can do that. I'm pretty sure I can't do that. I could try to maybe give you some inkling, maybe give you some description of what it's like. But Socrates doesn't think that he can actually take Glaucon to this knowledge, step by step, as he does in so many other things. He could take Glaucon to a knowledge of justice. He's just done that by depicting the just city and the just soul, okay? And Glaucon has been able to learn that. But there's something higher than that, more concrete knowledge that apparently Socrates knows, or Glaucon thinks he knows, and he wants it for himself. So Socrates says, I will not be able to describe to you the good itself, which is the highest idea that one can grasp. It's like the universal idea that informs all the others, okay? But I can give you another metaphor. I can give you a sort of picture of what it's like, okay? So this is where he describes the effect of the sun and how it illuminates the world, okay? He says the good of the intelligible world, the life of the mind, okay, is like the sun in the visible world. Okay? He uses these two terms. Intelligible and visible. The intelligible world is that which only the mind can grasp, but it is only imperfectly reflected in the natural world. The visible, of course, is what we see in the natural world. So he's saying that the good serves the same function in the intelligible world as the sun serves in the visible world. Okay? He says, if you notice, it is not the eye that causes sight, or even the object that causes sight, because if you're in complete darkness, you can't see a thing, though you may be looking. Okay? Has anybody ever been in a cave and they turn off the lights, and supposedly you have absolute darkness? Sometimes you can sort of see, but actually what you're seeing is your memory of what, like if you put your hand in front of your face, you may be able to, but it actually is your mind sort of playing tricks on you, because there's no light, and therefore there's no ability to see. Okay? So actually he says light is the missing ingredient, and it is the necessary ingredient for being able to see in the physical world. Okay? And just like that, the good is what allows us to think about all the other ideals in the intelligible world. Okay. He says on page 181 down at the bottom, the sun is not sight, but isn't it the cause of sight itself and seen by it? That's right. Then say then that this is what I call the offspring of the good, which is the good begot as its analog. What the good itself is in the intelligible realm in relation to understanding and intelligible things, the sun is in the visible realm in relation to sight and visible things. So this is about as good of a description as he gives. He goes on a little bit further, might help to make things a little bit clearer. He says, well, understand the soul in the same way. When it focuses on something illuminated by truth, and what is, it understands, knows, and apparently possesses understanding But when it focuses on what is mixed with obscurity, on what comes to be and passes away, it opines, it has opinions, and is dimmed, changes its opinions this way and that, and seems bereft of understanding. So that what gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knower is the form or the idea of the good. And though it is the cause of knowledge and truth, it is also an object of knowledge. Both knowledge and truth are beautiful things, but the good is other and more beautiful than they. In the visible realm, light and sight are rightly considered sun-like, but it is wrong to think that they are the sun. So here it is right to think of knowledge and truth as good-like, but wrong to think that either of them is the good, for the good is yet more prized. So, I don't know how well this can be understood by anybody, because Socrates seems to be saying that one achieves knowledge of the good at some point in the pursuit of knowledge about these other things that he's been talking about. In the process of philosophy, one somehow achieves the knowledge of the good, okay? But he can't show Glaucon exactly how to achieve the same knowledge. He's going to have to pursue it and obtain it in his own time. We have a word that might help a little bit with what he may be trying to describe, although I'm not talking about the 18th century movement, but just the event that happens where a person becomes enlightened. It's sort of an aha, where previously you didn't understand and now everything seems crystal clear. Okay? He seems to be describing something like that. Okay? And once you have that, then all the other ideas that philosophy strives to define and to apply become clear, and you can see that they are the product of the good. Now you can see why some later Christian thinkers and Jewish thinkers as well began to think that maybe Plato was really talking about God. Okay? If he was talking about God, he probably would have said so, since he did have teachings about God. And it's not clear here that he completely ties the two together. But I think it's understandable why people would maybe try to tie the two together. Because in their view, knowledge of God, true knowledge of God, does illuminate our understanding of everything else. Okay? So they said, well, maybe Plato was a pagan, but he was trying to describe God. Okay? But whatever he was describing, it's something that he thought he had, okay, that he couldn't directly convey to others. But it's the essence of accomplishment in philosophy. It's what you're striving for. And once you know the good, then it's permanently yours. And when we come back, we'll talk about this. There's a further explanation for this view of the good in his analogy of the cave. So we'll talk about that next time.